All right, this is an example of fish painted on a blue background, and I'm going to use some different types of whites to do some heightening after I've finished painting them into a watery scene. So the whole paper was painted blue first, then I drew my fish on top. Now I'm going to cut around the edges of the fish, and then I'm going to add a little bit of green to the water behind him or her. So you'll want to clean out your water as soon as it gets dirty, because otherwise your paints will be polluted. I'm going to go right up to the edge of the fish. You'll want to work with a large brush, and you want to try to put an even amount of water on the paper, which just takes practice and experience. Once your first coat of acrylic ink is down, you're starting to seal up the paper a little bit. After you have a few coats of acrylic, depending how saturated your ink is, you'll be creating a seal on the paper and it will become less absorbent. But when you use these thin washes, the paper absorbs a lot of water for the first few layers. And of course, you'll have to be careful about getting lint on your paper, because once the acrylic ink goes down, that lint will be sealed in and very difficult to remove. I'm going to dilute my green so that it's not too dark. You want to keep an eye on your whole page. It's easiest to start off working small while you get used to the materials. You don't want your edges to dry up on one part of the page before you get to come back and soften them. So you've got to really keep an eye on the way things are drying and make sure that you don't let your brush strokes show unless you're okay with that. And of course, the water is lighter as it moves up towards the surface. So now that I've got one coat of ink on, I'm going to get darker at the bottom of my page to give that sense of the depths of the water, going darker and darker as it approaches the floor. While my ink is still wet, I'm going to add even more saturation to the bottom half. And it can be a nice effect when you're doing a water scene to let some of the ink pool and give that sense of light coming through unevenly from the top of the ocean or lake or whatever it is. But I don't want any hard edges. Okay. So that paper is really too wet to do anything else with. I'll let it dry for a few minutes. All right, the next step will be to put the colors of my fish on first, and possibly the patterns if I want to add any. So this time I'll do the colors first and then add the value second. So I'm going to start with, again, just dampening the whole fish to avoid hard edges at first. That's my personal preference, is to put a wash first and then decide if I want to have some pattern or hard edges later. But I want to show that the fish is a color different from this water around him so that it doesn't look transparent. This is not a particular fish, I've just made a general shape. I'll put a thin wash of orange on the whole thing. And then while that ink is still wet, I'll add some pure color along the edges. So I want my fins to be pretty dramatic, so I'll add some red, along the edges and let it bleed and let the ink do what it wants. I'm making it really super saturated, probably too saturated. So I'm going to take some of that ink out. That's just too bright for my taste. So I'm adding some water to my brush. That drop of water won't really do any damage since the ink is dry. If that were watercolor, it would make a stain. But since the acrylic ink is dry, that spot won't matter. I need a bigger brush. I want to work pretty quickly while this is still wet to desaturate some of that color. So I'm putting lots of water, lots of clean water in my brush and adding it to that wet ink. Okay, that's more what I had in mind. Now I want to put a little more water on the tail because I think that's fairly dry. This time I'll be careful not to add fully saturated ink to the tail. I don't want it to be so dark. But I do like some of the bleeding that I'm getting from having this hard edge where the edge of the tail was against the dry paper of this water, but wet inside the tail to give me this nice bleeding. And then I'll do the same thing with this bottom fin. It would be hard to do the fin inside the body right now because the paper's wet, so it won't stay inside that area that I have drawn. So when the whole fish body is dry, I'll come back and do that fin. This bottom fin was too dry to get that nice bleeding effect, so luckily it wasn't so dry that the edges can't be softened, but I didn't get that bleeding effect that I planned on. Now that I've wet it, I can get that nice bleeding. And as this dries, I can see that it's drying very light, so I'm adding a little bit more ink to it. So like I said, it's better to build your way up to these dark saturated colors because there's no going back once they're dry. So I'll let that dry. I'm going to lift up this spot of water with a clean rag just because I want the whole page to dry quickly. So make sure your rag is clean, and then you can just take away the little spot, but it doesn't leave a stain. Okay, next I'm going to add a little color to this fin, and I think I'll put a little bit more of a pattern on the body too. So first I'll carefully dampen the fin. Oops. I can guide that ink into place a little bit while it's still wet. And then while that's drying, I think I'll darken the eyeball. Anything that I want with a hard edge I can do now while the paper is dry. So I'll get that eye. Oops, that ink is too diluted to get very dark. I'll let the mouth, the line of the mouth be very dark. And I think I'll draw that gill in. I'm not really worried about scientific accuracy right now. I just want you to experiment with the colored inks. And you can invent your fish today. I'm going to put in a little bit of value. I'm working wet onto dry paper right now, so I can put these little value shifts that I want to have hard edges in. I think I'll leave it there for now. Oh, I can put some little lines in the fins right now, since I don't want those lines to bleed too much. So I could have drawn these in with pencil first if I really wanted to have everything planned out carefully beforehand, but I'm going to wing it a little bit. I'll do the same with the back tail. You can see that my values were so light before they were barely visible. So I had to put a little more saturated ink in there. It's nice to give a little bit of a sense of texture to your fish painting so it doesn't just look like a flat cutout. Then I'll add the same thing to this fin. And then in a couple minutes, this should be dry enough that I can add some value to the body of the fish to look at three-dimensional, make it look three-dimensional. And then we will put in some details in the background. We'll create a little bit of a habitat for the fish. All right, this is dry enough now that I can put some values on my fish to give the body some form. So again, I will be careful to cut around this fin because it's sticking out from the side of the fish, so I want to make sure that it remains lighter, and I'll put a darker, cooler value underneath it. Of course, when the sunlight is providing light, the light is warm, which means the shadow is cool. If you're working indoors from natural light, the light is cool and the shadow is warm. And if you're using indoor man-made lighting, then it could be warm or cool. But the shadow is always the opposite temperature of the light source. So if your light is warm, your shadow is cool. That's why I'm using these cool violet. I'll add a little bit of blue to cool it down even a little more. But my shadows will be cool. This might be darker than I intended. We'll see what happens when it dries. It's nice to experiment with putting your values in first versus your local color with these colored inks, or then doing the reverse of putting the local color in first and then your values to see what the difference is. So I'm imagining the light is coming from up here and casting the back side of the body in shadow. I could have sketched out the general shape of my shadow first, but I'm just not attached, so I'm experimenting here. But I'm implying that there's a little bit of light on the top of the fin. I want to soften that a little bit. And now you see my fish has a more three-dimensional form. So I'll let that dry. Actually, I think while it's wet, I'm going to try to put a darker value in the body of this shadow, and I'm going to try to keep the ink from bleeding out to the edge because I want to have a little bit of reflected light along the bottom of the fish to give it a true three-dimensional form. There's always a little bit of reflected light coming around the edges of a round shape. We'll see if the paper is too wet. If the paper is too wet, then my ink is going to bleed all the way to the edge of the wet area. I think this is working. All right, I'll let that dry for a minute. Okay, I'm going to show you how I would fix what I would consider a mistake. I don't like the way this bled onto the body of the fish because now it's making this look a little bit flat. And also I didn't intend to have that red spot on the body of the fish. So what I'll do is I'll put more spots on the fish so that that looks like it was my intention. So because I'm making this fish up, it doesn't matter. If you were trying to be accurate, you would have a hard time fixing this in colored ink. You'd have to use something opaque to cover up that spot. So I will dampen the fish body, and then I'm going to put some little red spots on the body as a pattern so that that looks intentional. Oh, and it's happened here too, so. Luckily, when we're inventing, we can find a way to make these things work that would otherwise be frustrating. Because I have kept the fin dry, I can bring that ink right up to the edge, and actually it's nice because now it's making that fin look like it's really coming out perpendicularly from the body, so we'll call it a happy accident. Now we have our own tropical fish. or a fish with the chicken pox. Okay, I'll let that dry, and then I'm going to come back in. I don't like these hard edges. Soften them up a little. I'll let this dry, and then I'm going to come back in and paint some seaweed in the background so that he looks like he's in the water. And I think I'll make all of this a bit darker for a little more drama. Okay, my next step is to unify the sense of the fish in the water. I made the shadows violet, which is not really related to the color of the water. So I want them a little darker anyway. This time I'll use a little bit of this green so that it looks like it's part of the same universe as the water that it's supposed to be in. So again, I want to put a little bit of a damp surface all over the body. And I'll have to make sure to get the shadows on this fin too, so that it looks like it's underwater and not getting light from somewhere else entirely. You can also see a little bit of a stain here because I added water while the ink was drying, and the water pushed the ink up and created that stain, but I'll just have to live with it. It's fairly subtle. So now you can see already that now it looks like this fish is part of this same aqua universe, now that I've adjusted that shadow color. I should have done that in the first place, but I was not paying close attention. I was talking and painting at the same time. Okay, that's much better. Now it really looks like it's starting to reflect the color of the water, the atmospheric light. So I'll let that dry before I continue. Okay, next I'm going to add some seaweed. So I could have drawn it out carefully, but instead I'm just going to wing it. So I'll mix up a little bit of a warm green wash. I'll put some yellow in my green here. Maybe a little orange to make it a little more neutral. Let's see. Got some orange ink here. I want that seaweed to be a little more neutral. I don't want it to steal the show from the fish's colors. And then I'll just test this out on a test strip. Oh, maybe a little too brown. Go back over to this green pile here. That's a little better. I want it somewhere in between. I think I want a little more yellow in there. That looks about right. Try that out. Yeah, not bad. I'll start with that and then I can always add to it later. So I'll try to make it look like it's behind the fish. And I'm just using this filbert to turn it sideways. The bristles are coming apart. I haven't taken good care of this brush, so it's not ideal. Maybe I'll look for a better brush. Yeah, I need a better brush. These bristles are splitting, so I can't get a nice flowing line. Let's see what else I've got. Seems like I haven't taken good care of my brushes. This one's splitting too. Anyway, I'm using it like a calligraphy brush to try to get some movement in these seaweed leaves rather. I use this drawing brush because it has a better point. And of course, with the inks used transparently like this, I'll be seeing some of the overlapping seaweed leaves crossing each other if I'm working once the ink has started to dry. So either I'll live with that or I'll be very careful to cut around it. So if I don't want the leaves to look like they're overlapping, I would wait till one is very dry and then come up to the edge. But instead, I think I'll just go over both of the leaves because that one was a little bit wet still. Oops. It's easier to move the paper sometimes, so instead of trying to angle your arm. So I'll move the paper around a little bit so I can add some seaweed up here. You can see this overlapping effect that I'm getting as one leaf dries and then I paint over it. So I'm going to darken everything up because it is very light right now. It's nice to keep some of the transparency in the seaweed so that it looks like it's in this underwater world. But I've got my inks diluted enough that it's okay to add a few layers. It won't get too dark. Okay. That I think is enough to get the point across for now. If I wanted to, I could put some seaweed in front of the fish. Obviously, if I put a thin wash of ink over this fish, the fish will show through and it would make the seaweed look like it were transparent. So I'd want to use something, maybe an acrylic gouache, to go over the front of the fish if I were to paint seaweed in front of the fish. But I'm just going to leave it as is, let this fish appear that he's in front of the seaweed. I think I'll add a little bit more blue-green to his underside because it's looking still very pale and light. I'd like to give it a little bit more contrast and value. So I'll add another layer. Chances are it's going to bleed onto the seaweed, but I think I'll try to live with that. So before I add another layer of value, I'll want to put a little wash over the whole fish again so that it doesn't leave hard edges. And then, of course, I always want to test out my color on a piece of the same kind of paper. It could be darker because I know this is going to dry a bit lighter than it looks wet. So I'm going to add a little ink to that diluted pool. That looks about right, just a little darker. So again, I'm trying to leave a slightly lighter value by the edge of his body to get that reflected light touching the bottom of the fish. And now it's starting to have a little bit more volume. And then we would have a little bit of reflected light on the underside of his body there, but the fin would be in shadow. So it's a very subtle, should be a very subtle thing where we get a little bit of reflected light on the underside of the body. And then I can even add a little bit of this shadow color into the seaweed. I'm going to dilute it so that it's not competing with the fish that's supposed to be in the foreground. But I want to give a sense of 3 dimensions in these seaweed leaves. So I'll add a bit of shadow where I'm imagining that one leaf crosses over the other. Like a softer edge here, so I can soften that a little bit with a damp brush. And then I could, of course, show the underside of the seaweed turning. So using your brush as a sort of calligraphy brush, we can imply that the seaweed is turning and folding as it does. So as you add your shadows, you want to think about which leaf is supposed to be in front of the other. We're also thinking about the direction of the light as we do this. So if the light is coming from the upper left corner, we'd want to think about which planes are really facing that direction and which are turned away from the light. So for example, if this leaf is coming up, turning, coming back down, this plane would be facing the light, and this one is sloped away from the light. So I'll dilute that a little bit, and I'll try to soften the edge, but I want to show that this plane is turned away from the light. And all of this comes from drawing from observation. Once you draw from observation for a while, you can apply that knowledge to your invented scene. So it's very useful, even if you're just drawing cubes and cylinders and pyramids, to set up your light so that you can control the direction of the light and understand how that affects the shapes of the shadows and the length of the shadows, etc. And as you can see, my ink was so diluted that it dried to nearly impossible to see. So at least I have my shadows planned out, and I can use those shapes and go back over them with a darker ink. So this should give you plenty to think about this week as you paint your fish. You'll do one from the imagination and one from finding an online resource, unless you have a book of fish that you can use, or unless you want to go to the aquarium in Baltimore, which is worth a visit. There we have it, the beginning, the almost completed fish painting.